A professional fighter named Cody Garbrandt walked into a weigh-in in 2016, having dropped over 13 pounds in 72 hours. He made weight. He looked sharp. 12 hours later, standing under the UFC lights, his body gave out in ways nobody fully predicted. The chin that once absorbed clean shots without flinching couldn't hold up. He went down twice in the first round. His coach said afterward that Cody wasn't the same person who showed up to camp. I've been sitting with that story ever since, because the science explains exactly what happened. And the explanation goes back about 1,000 years. Here's something nobody in combat sports wants to say out loud. The modern weight cut might be the single most damaging thing an athlete does to themselves before the most physically demanding event of their life. You starve, you dehydrate, you shrink your brain, and I mean that literally, not as a figure of speech, and then you walk into a cage and ask your body to produce knockout power. Meanwhile, Norse warriors in 900 AD were eating 4,000 calories of dense animal fat, fermented fish, and dried meat before raiding coastal villages, rowing back across open ocean and doing it all again the following week. No weight class, no depletion cycle, just fuel and function. So how's that possible? And more importantly, what did they know that we somehow stopped caring about? Let's be real about what a modern weight cut actually does to the body. Not the version where athletes smile and say they've done this 100 times and their body's used to it. The real version. When you drop 10 to 15% of your body weight in 48 hours, which elite fighters do routinely, your plasma volume drops, your muscles stop firing cleanly, your processing slows, and the fluid surrounding your brain thins. That last one is what keeps researchers up at night. A 2019 study from the University of Gothenburg, tracking combat sport athletes through full weight cuts, found measurable reductions in cerebrospinal fluid, the liquid cushioning your brain, that had not fully recovered by fight time, even after rehydration. That tightness in your temples the morning after a hard dehydration session, that's not tiredness. That's your brain sitting in less protection than it's built to have. And here's the part that gets to me personally. This isn't some fringe practice. This is the standard protocol. The fighters you watch every weekend are cycling through this over and over across multi-year careers. The gut damage alone from crash rehydration, where athletes flood their system with fluid immediately after weigh-ins, puts enormous strain on intestinal walls and wipes out microbiome diversity that can take months to come back. We've built an entire nutrition industry around managing the wreckage of a system that didn't have to exist this way. But nobody at the top has any financial reason to question whether the system itself is broken, so nobody does. What actually happened with Viking nutrition wasn't complicated, and that's exactly what makes it worth paying attention to. Norse warriors on long-distance raids ate a few specific things consistently: pemmican-style dried meat packed with rendered animal fat, skyer, which is a fermented dairy product with a higher protein density than most modern Greek yogurts, cured and fermented fish like rackfisk, and dried grains for slower burning energy. A single portion of traditional Norse pemmican, meat and fat, in roughly a 1-to-1 ratio by weight, could deliver over 500 calories in something smaller than your closed fist. This was food built for endurance under cold, brutal conditions, not designed in a lab, designed by 1,000 years of figuring out what kept a person functional when their survival depended on it. The fat ratio is where everything connects, and it leads directly to something researchers now call fat adaptation. When your diet stays consistently high in fat and low in fast-burning carbohydrates over a long enough period, your body shifts its primary fuel source away from glucose and toward fatty acids. That shift takes weeks to complete, but once it does, your energy output becomes remarkably steady. No spikes, no crashes, no wall. The Norse warriors weren't carb loading before a raid, the way modern athletes do before competition. They were running on fat that their bodies had learned over months of consistent eating to burn cleanly and efficiently. And the fermented foods, the skyer, the rackfisk, were doing something else on top of that. They were keeping gut bacteria in the shape needed to maximize how much nutrition actually got pulled from every single bite. This wasn't lucky. This was a food system that held up because it had to. I'll be straight with you. When I first read the research on fat adaptation and combat performance, I thought people were overselling it. The fitness world has a long history of latching onto ideas like religion, and ketogenic diets in particular attract a certain kind of breathless enthusiasm that makes me skeptical. But the underlying science is real, and it comes from people who aren't trying to sell you anything. Dr. Jeff Volek at Ohio State University has studied fat-adapted athletes for over 2 decades. His 2016 research, published in the journal Metabolism, found that trained fat-adapted endurance athletes oxidized fat at rates up to 2.3 times higher than carbohydrate-dependent athletes, even at high exercise intensities. What that means in practice is that a fat-adapted body sustains output longer before hitting empty and refills its fuel reserves faster between hard efforts. For a Viking rowing 8 hours and then fighting on a beach, that's the difference between functional and finished. The fermentation angle gets far less credit than it deserves. A 2021 study from Stanford University, led by Dr. Justin Sonnenberg and published in Cell, found that a diet high in fermented foods increased microbiome diversity and reduced inflammatory markers within 10 weeks. Participants eating fermented foods regularly showed measurably better immune response and lower systemic inflammation than a control group eating high-fiber diets. Now, put that into an athletic training camp where inflammation from daily hard training is constant, and recovery is the variable that decides whether a camp produces a fighter or breaks one. The Viking gut, shaped by regular skyer, fermented fish, and aged dairy, was likely in significantly better shape than the gut of a modern fighter 3 weeks into a restrictive cut. That's not nostalgia talking, that's inflammation biology. Here's where it gets strange, and where I think we've genuinely had this wrong for a long time. Modern combat sports nutrition is built almost entirely around weight class manipulation. The goal isn't to build the most functional body. The goal is to squeeze the biggest possible body into a smaller weight class temporarily. So athletes train heavy, cut hard, rehydrate fast, and then fight at a size their body was never built to hold. The Viking had no weight class. He needed functional mass, solid bone density, strong ligaments, muscle that kept working, because his life depended on it performing for hours, not for 3 5-minute rounds. A 2022 analysis from the Norwegian School of Sports Sciences found that athletes following traditional Nordic high-fat dietary protocols over 12 weeks maintained explosive output comparable to carbohydrate-loaded athletes while showing significantly lower cortisol levels during recovery. Lower cortisol means less muscle breakdown. Less breakdown means more of what you built actually shows up on fight night. Now, I want to be fair here. There's probably a version of this argument I'm overstating. A Viking warrior and a professional prize fighter are not the same athlete. And the burst power demands of a 3-round fight are genuinely different from the sustained work of a sea raid. Modern carbohydrate loading has real science behind it for high-intensity, short-duration efforts. I'm not saying throw all of that away. But here's the thing I keep coming back to. A fighter who never had to destroy themselves to make weight would arrive at fight night with their brain fully cushioned, their gut intact, their cortisol low, and their muscle firing cleanly. That fighter doesn't need to recover from their own preparation. Right now, most fighters do. The cost isn't theoretical anymore. Between 2019 and 2024, at least 4 professional MMA fighters suffered acute medical emergencies directly linked to severe weight cutting. Multiple athletic commissions had to implement emergency protocols mid-season. Research published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine in 2021 estimated that up to 40% of combat sport athletes engage in what the authors called harmful weight-cutting behavior, meaning cuts that produce measurable physiological damage before competition. There's a cold knot that settles in your gut when you really sit with that number. We built a system that requires athletes to hurt themselves before they compete, and then we put them across from another athlete and call it sport. We normalize this, and the people paying the price are the ones we claim to admire. Here's what's already shifting. A growing group of MMA coaches and sports dietitians are testing what some call ancestral performance protocols, training camps built on high-fat, fermented food bases throughout preparation, with targeted carbohydrate introduction in the final 10 to 14 days before a fight. Nutrition programs at facilities like AKA in San Jose are beginning to work fat adaptation research into long-term camp planning. Some athletic bodies in Scandinavia have funded pilot studies looking specifically at Nordic dietary baselines for combat athletes. It's early, the data is still building, but the direction keeps pointing the same way, back toward food systems that were built for exactly the kind of physical stress that fighting demands. So here's what I want to leave you with. If you could fuel for competition without destroying yourself first, would the sport look different? Drop your thoughts below, especially if you're a fighter or coach who's tried cutting differently, because I don't think we're anywhere near done with this conversation.